Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar. My name is Andrew Townsend. I'm an e-learning evangelist here at eLearning Brothers. Today's webinar is going to be about how to align creative e-learning themes with instructional intent. We are glad you've all joined us. This webinar will be recorded. We'll send a copy of it out to everyone who is in attendance, who is registered later today. We're also going to post this on our blog probably early next week. So you can watch it there as you wish. If you have questions during the webinar, we'll be ready to answer those questions in the questions panel, so please do use that. It looks like some of you have already found it. And I'll try to bring up questions to Misty as we can. If we can't get to some of your questions, we will try to respond to those either in the follow-up email later today or in the webinar recap. Also, just so you know, one of the things that we like to do after the webinar is try to follow up as soon as possible. A lot of the times it's just to answer the questions that we weren't able to get to, make sure that we're touching base and making sure all of your questions were answered. To talk to us about e-learning themes and instructional intent, we have Misty Harding, our instructional design and program manager, with us. Thanks, Misty, for your time. We appreciate your willingness to do these. And you've done a lot of webinars. If you guys want to see more of Misty's webinars, you can look those up on our blog. You can search for her name. You can also search for under the tag of webinars, and those will all be there. And Misty's also going to be speaking at ELBX, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But without further ado, I do want to give you as much time as possible, so I'll go ahead and turn the time over to you, Misty.
Thanks, Andrew. Andrew knows that I take a lot of time on my webinars. Well, hey guys, welcome. Thanks for joining. I wish I would have had a better title for this, and I hope that I'm delivering what you're expecting. But what we're talking about today are the times that we get excited and we want to develop really creative, cool courses, but sometimes we get a little bit out of alignment with what we're actually trying to accomplish because we get so excited about the theme. I don't know if you guys have ever seen these Pinterest fails. I love these. I love these because I've been subject to these. It's really easy to get excited about things that are fun and creative. And we kind of want to jump right in and do it. And then it's usually in the execution of that type of a project that we realize, wait a minute, I think maybe this was a little bit more complicated than I gave it credit for. And the seems true for our e-learning courses. Even the creative and fun courses still require technique. And in the case of what we're talking about today, instructional alignment, to truly come together rather than fall apart, kind of like this cupcake. So today we're going to talk about 5 specific elements that will help keep your creatively themed courses coming together instead of falling apart. And we're going to talk about each one as far as what does it mean. I have some examples to share with you. And then for each one, I have a slide of pro tips for how you implement it, or questions you should be asking yourself, or how to make sure that you're in alignment as you decide upon that element. I am going to stop at the end of each one of these elements, usually on the pro tip slide, and provide you an opportunity to ask questions if you have them. So here are these 5 elements for creative design. I've been thinking for years about putting together some material on this topic, and I think what has held me back is that I felt like I needed to find a way to tell people, well, here's step 1, step 2, step 3 to doing this. And what I've realized over time is that it's not really a step 1, step 2, step 3. There are essential elements to the design of that type of a course that have to kind of all come together, and they have to fit, but you don't necessarily have to start with one or the other. And so the way that I've chosen to represent this is a puzzle piece. And it's because as we think about the experience of putting a puzzle together, usually strategically, you're going to start from the corners or the edges, right? And then you're going to work your way in and have everything fit. And you don't have to start in the upper left corner or the bottom right corner. You're going to take a look at everything that's in front of you, and you're going to probably gravitate towards what makes sense first, or what's the easiest piece first. And then you start to build out from there. And what I would suggest to you is that what we're talking about today works very similarly. in that you might already have a really clear idea about what you want the learner to do within your course, and then you want to build around that. Or you might already have a really clear idea about the story that you want to tell, and you can build around that. So you can start from anywhere and bring it together. But what matters most is that the course in the end comes together and all of these pieces actually fit. What I've seen over the years is that instructional designers get really jazzed about one or two of these pieces, and they think, oh, that would be so exciting. I'm going to do that. And then they just force the rest to fit, or they forget to consider the other pieces. And then in the end, they have something that just doesn't make sense. And that's the whole point of what we're talking about today. How can you execute on all of these pieces, design something awesome, and in the end, still have it all make sense and align with what you're trying to do instructionally, because that's what the pressure is on you to do. And so we want to have fun, but we also want to be effective. So we're going to start with I'm just going to start up here with theme. Now, again, you can start wherever you want, but I'm going to start with theme. So a theme is an overall creative setting for your course. And I have some examples here. There could be a million of them. You know, maybe you want to do some type of a Wild West theme. Maybe you just a jungle excursion. Maybe it's going to be crime. We're guilty of doing the spy theme a lot in e-learning, and the crime one too, I feel like. It could be a setting. It could be in the future. It could be a location like a desert island. You can still do creatively themed courses that occur in the real world. That's fine, and you can still have fun with that, and I'll show you guys a couple of samples of that, or at least tell stories within that type of a setting. You also can do the real world with a twist, which represented here by our zombie apocalypse. BT-dub, do not search the internet for images of zombies. I learned that lesson the hard way, and just let me pass that from me to you. Don't do it. It was pretty scary. So, and then we have on here a Mars colony. So I think you guys get the picture. So that's the gist of what a theme is. But here are some pro tips. This is where I find people a lot of times go wildly wrong, because your theme has to be in alignment with some criteria. So first of all, does it even fit your audience demographic? You need to be really in touch with that, because there's so much that can go wrong on it. And that's what I found over the years. Like, the more creative we try to be, the more we kind of open ourselves up to issues. Does it fit your company culture, or at least not violate it? If you're in a more serious industry, a highly regulated industry, there's a lot that can come into play. And so you need to ask yourself those questions. If your course is going to be sent out to a global audience, the other thing you've got to consider too is it a concept that's going to be globally understood? Sometimes people want to theme courses around pop culture items that are unique to their own culture and don't necessarily make sense outside of that culture. And so you've got to be looking for things that are broad and relatively benign as well, because you don't want anything to be distasteful. So for example, the zombie apocalypse, you know, that could definitely be a great e-learning course theme if maybe you work at Universal Studios and that's kind of in alignment with your culture. But for the most part, probably not going to work. You're going to need to have something that's more generic. You also want to make sure that you're not, kind of back on the culture topic, that you're not over-representing your particular culture. For example, constantly American instructional designers will put together themes, pop culture references, idioms that are very Americanized, even though they're designing for a global audience. You want to watch for that. And the other big thing that I'd mention is media. When you're thinking, okay, I want to do, especially for example, something like the future. I want this to be set in the future, and I want it to look really futuristic. Okay, well, do you have access to media or stock photography and enough of it that it's going to be able to visually support that theme throughout the build of your course? And while I say that, I don't want to dissuade you from trying to get creative, because actually, if you can come up with even just 5 to 10 really good images of different key visuals that you would need, you can usually get by with just that. You can zoom in on pieces and crop them. You could reuse a couple different angles. So there are really simple ways that you can still achieve that, even if you only have access to a few images, but it's something you want to ask yourself before you commit to a theme. Most of all, though, and that's what we have here at the bottom, the biggest pro tip that I would give you is your theme going to allow the learner to do what they need to do? And by that, I mean, can they have a role within, and we're going to talk about story in a minute, but in this type of a theme, is it going to allow them to practice the right instructional tasks? Because if you can't find a way to link that theme to what they need to do, it's not going to work. So you may want to explore your theme and then kind of put a pin in it. And this is, again, why I kind of compare this to this process to putting a puzzle together. Because you might get a couple pieces that you think are right, and you may want to hold on to them and then go somewhere else for a minute, like to story or to role, and say, okay, well, yeah, if I had that, and then I did this, is that fitting? Well, yeah, I kind of think that fits together. Well, but what about the tasks, you know, and you're kind of starting to put those pieces together until eventually you'll have them all come together, or you'll realize that there's some breakage. And so sometimes you've got to put a pin in one. You're getting some good momentum going, but you're going to put a pin in it, and then you're going to start to see how that plays out in other pieces of what we're talking about today with story or role or task. So before I move on, I'm going to move on and talk about story and how your story kind of rolls up inside your theme. But before I move on, Andrew, are there any questions that are coming in about theme right now?
No questions here yet. Looks like this is all pretty well understood. If you guys have questions, by all means, go ahead and send them in. And if we can't get to them, we'll get to them later or after the webinar.
Okay, great. Let's move on to story. So the story is something that rolls up underneath your theme. I've got an example here. So the basic construct of what you want to be thinking about story-wise. So you've got your setting, whether it's the future, or it's a desert island, or it's the jungle. And then you're thinking, okay, when I start the course, how can I set the scene for where this is occurring? How can I immediately immerse them into where they're at and what's happening? Then we're going to give them a problem or a challenge. We need their help in some way. They have a task to achieve, and this is told through the story, right? We don't want the narrator kind of coming in boring and saying, you know, your task is to. It's more engaging if we can set it up through a story. And then as they start to execute on that problem or challenge, there will be consequences, failures, and coaching that are also tied in with the story's progression. And then ultimately a conclusion that illustrates that they achieved the goal through the way that the story ends or through what happens. So let me give you an example of what that means. So if we pick the theme of desert island, and then we have some type of that our course is about project management, for example. So we might down here in immersion have, okay, so there's a plane crash. We've washed ashore on the desert island. These are all of the supplies and the people that we have left. But in order to light the signal fire, right, we feel like we've got to get to the other side of the island because that is where it'll be most visible for planes. And so your task up here in challenge, in order to survive or be rescued, you, learner, as the project manager, quote unquote, need to optimize the team resources and activities to get across the island in like various journey legs, right? So it could be you've got to get to the waterfall, then you're going to have to climb the mountain to get across the island to get to a signal zone. So that's your challenge, and you have these limited resources, etc. Well then, okay, so what are going to be the consequences? So as they have these legs and they're performing instructional tasks where they're having to decide what to do with resources or people, what's going to happen to them? So like what, and part of the reason I have this in pink here is to highlight a point. What happens when the resources run out? What happens when certain trip legs are achieved or not achieved? What will the consequences be? And how can we align those consequences with what happens in real life? This is an example of where the theme that you've selected or the story that you're trying to embed within your theme can start to go wrong, or at the very least needs to be problem solved. So like, for example, if we say, okay, your first task is to get to the waterfall, and here are your supplies and here are your people, and they mismanage those resources, is someone going to starve? I mean, is that, because you're dealing with the realities of the theme that you've chosen, but sometimes those realities seem a little bit more harsh or not really something that you would want to do within a course. And so I'm going to give you an example of my husband and I don't know if you guys have been out. Ready Player One is in the theaters right now, at least here in the US. And in this story, this guy has kind of created this virtual world that people can come play in. But as he played video games as a youth, he always thought it was really over the top, when someone died to have to see blood and that type of a thing. So when he created his virtual world, he said, if something happens to someone, I just want to see all their money explode out, all their money and things that they've collected explode out. And that was his symbol, for death, so that he didn't have to have blood. So using a concept like that, I think it's a great illustration of how you can get creative within your own world. So naturally, you might be thinking on this desert island that if resources are mismanaged or something, or people are mismanaged, that they're maybe going to starve or they're going to get injured or something that, is kind of negative and maybe you don't want to do. You don't have to do that though. You can get creative. So you can say, okay, well, what if they just get sunburned or like have a temper tantrum? Wouldn't that, that could be funny and also semi-realistic to what happens on projects, right? And far less grim than having somebody die on the island. So that's something to problem solve. But I also call this out to you because it's a great example of how you really do need to think through each of these points before you commit to what your story is going to be and how it starts to align with another piece, which is instructional tasks. Because if you don't think it all the way through, for example, a lot of people will just do maybe the immersion and the challenge, and they're like, yeah, this sounds good. And they're not thinking through to, okay, well, what are the consequences that we're going to write into this story? Or how does it conclude? For example, what happens if the learner fails the ultimate challenge, which is getting to the other side of the island? What's going to happen? Does the group not survive? I mean, what is that end piece? And what are you comfortable with? And what fits your demographic? And what fits your culture? And what's in alignment with the story? And hopefully, how can we make that conclusion piece in alignment with the business results in some way to highlight the business results of what they're learning? If you do or do not do this thing that you're learning, what are the business results? That's usually what you want that conclusion to tie to. So anyway, these are the 4 things that I would encourage you to really think through before you fully commit to a story, and then make sure that it links up with your theme and the next piece we're going to talk about, which is instructional tasks. And I wanted to show you an example of, this is from a course that we did, where one of the fun ways that you can create a challenge in a story is to give the learner a villain. And in this case, we had this villain guy who was kind of cyber attacking the business. And that can be a fun challenge too, and also provides a lot of interesting pieces that can come into the story. And sometimes allows you to offload some of the consequences because you've got 2 people that you're playing with. You're not just talking about your team or your people, but there's things going on with the villain too. So that's just a quick suggestion. So here are some pro tips. We've talked about a couple of these for your story. So before you finalize your story, make sure again, your problems, consequences, and outcomes are contextually appropriate. Which we've talked about demographic, we've talked about global audience, but also politically sensitive. Sometimes there's things going on in the news, or you just want to kind of cross-check all of that to make sure it's going to be okay. And get the input of some other people. Don't just check that with yourself. Get some input. You're also going to need appropriate visuals and media to support the problems, the consequences, and the outcomes. So for example, if we do decide that not getting to the waterfall is going to produce a temper tantrum from a couple people in the group, do we have the imagery for that? So whatever I'm conceptualizing in my story, I'm going to need to have media for as well. And the three main things I want to talk about are the way that your story is constructed. Is it going to allow for progression of events in a way that feels engaging to the learner? Or is it kind of a ho-hum boring story because it is so one-for-one related to instructional tasks that it doesn't really feel like a story at all? So check yourself there. And then, but at the same time, we still have to allow for the learner to experience as close as we can, approximating their reality as close as we can. What are the instructional tasks that we're hoping to expose them to? Or the types of effective experiences, or whatever your instructional intent is for the course. I'm getting creative and I'm having fun, but at the end of the day, this still has to work out instructionally. So I got to check myself here before I commit. And then, does the progression of the story and those tasks and consequences actually align as much as I can get it to what happens in real life for the learner? Because then I am maximizing the instructional value in my course. So I have an example in here. You know, are the consequences, which are, or choices, decisions, behaviors in the story, are they aligned in kind of the same way of what's going to happen to the learner in their own job if they fail or succeed? So in the case of the desert island story, if they fail to coordinate the resources, the team is going to suffer setbacks either through time or results. So how can I emulate that really within the story and within the theme that I've committed to? Because it's similar to what would happen to a project manager in real life. So for example, if I mismanage my water, I'm going to have a leg of this journey where people are complaining about being thirsty, or so you're starting to pull that string through as you commit to the story. I'm going to pause here again, Andrew, to see if anybody has questions about story.
Yes, there are a few of these going about both story and theme here. Here's one going back to theme a little bit. Is choosing a setting necessary, or can we just choose a style instead of a theme? Absolutely.
And that's part of what I was going to touch on. There are pieces of this that you don't necessarily have to do, but I wanted to represent all of there are definitely courses where you can use them all, but there are some where you can choose not to, or you can choose not to go as heavy. And in fact, I have a couple examples at the end of the deck of where you didn't necessarily have a story, but you had a theme. And so you can also choose to have a theme without a story. But the more of these you add, of course, the more immersion and engagement you can get.
Sure. Another person says, it's easy to see how this works with soft skills training, but will it also fit well with software application training users on how to use a software application?
You know, it can. We've actually done that before. We did a course, I think that it's out on the internet. I'm trying to think of where it would be. But we helped to put together the training that came out for the last version of Captivate. And we created a story where the learner was involved in helping two employees who were actually developers and designers take on really heavy, challenging tasks at work by learning to use the features that Captivate had. You could check that out because I know it's available and it's out there. It's kind of an open, because it's an example that I think bundled with the course, but yes, you can. It's a little bit, I'm not going to lie, it's more challenging with software, but there are ways to do it.
Okay.
Probably not on a desert island.
The last question in this segment is, how do we stop the infinite loop? For example, getting to the consequences step, seeing that it doesn't fit the theme or reality, and going back to select another one, following the same checkpoints, and again, it doesn't fit, and going back to the beginning again to select another one, etc. That's where we spend a lot of our creative time and never produce anything. We've learned a lot, especially what is not working, but we haven't made any progress on this project.
Oh. Send me an email about what your project is. Send me an email and I will answer that question. But at a high level, I will help you with that. I'm willing to brainstorm that with you. Sorry, I'm pointing with my lip gloss now. You know how trainers have markers? Apparently I'm using lip gloss today. Lip gloss is it's fundamental. Like if I was on a desert island, I'd have this. But to answer your question at a high level, if you have a piece like that's like, gosh, this is where we always get stuck, start at that piece and build out from there. So this is another great example of why I say it's like a puzzle piece, because some pieces are easy. I was talking with one of the other designers here and about this. I'm like, does it make sense to say it's like a puzzle? And she's like, yeah, it totally does. And we were talking about how we've had themes, like for years, we've wanted to use them in courses and we never can because we can't get them to fit. And so, so if you have a tough piece like that, start there. And be asking yourself, what are the consequences in the real life, in real life, and what does that look like? Now, sometimes you can lift and shift, right? So let's go back to the example of the project manager where it's like, gosh, do they have to die? Well, what happens to a project manager if they don't do their job, right? They definitely do have people throwing tantrums. That's a real thing. Like, so how could we take that, you know, and let them kind of experience the consequences of having, you know, a leader who's upset, or, you know, you can kind of lift and shift those and still fit them within a story. Anyway, but I'll just say, send me an email. I'd be happy to help you brainstorm that. But I would say start in that and then build around it.
All right, great. There's a few more questions, but we'll take those later.
Okay. All right, let's go on to goals. So we've touched on this a little bit within Story because it's part of it. But I want to talk more specifically about goals because sometimes I think, and what I've seen is we spend time talking about the goals for the learner up front, but we don't always do the best job of maturing those goals throughout the course and helping them connect to them and showing them what's happening. So when you're thinking about the goals for your learner, and again, this is within the story or within the theme, why are they here? Why is this worth their time? How are we getting them involved? So what are they solving? Who are they helping? Are they trying to collect or earn something? Are they trying to prevent some terrible thing from happening? Are they performing small tasks that are going to add up to something bigger? And one of the biggest things too that I've realized that I've screwed up over the years is not really rewarding them for achieving those challenges, whether they're small or whether it's what it adds up to at the end. In fact, I was just looking back at something I designed years ago where I was like, gosh, I had them do all of this stuff. And then in the end, it's just, well, thanks, you can close the window now. Like there's no celebration, there's no end to the story. And so goals and story are really closely aligned, but sometimes we'll get more into the story or more into the instructional tasks. And along the way, we'll kind of start to forget about goals. So here are some ways that you can show progress throughout the course to make, these are just some of them, there are others, but ways that you can show progress. So we have what you could think of as 0 to goal. So what's the quantifiable collection of achievements that are going to add up to something? So that's, is it points? Is it dollars? Is it the number of sales they made in a month? Something quantifiable that they're seeing build. We can also use meters. We got like that stress-o-meter down there. How well something is being done. Kind of a judgment meter, poor, fair, good, excellent. You have badges that they can collect. Usually badges are used for skills, to kind of demonstrate that they've banked a skill of some kind or made an achievement in the story. You can also have maps. So sometimes you're using a visual map to show. You could have like little waypoints or different pieces on the map that they're turning colors, that they're checking off, or they're clearing a zone, or they've solved a problem in this building, and the map is showing them that. You can also do gradual build. We did a course one time that we kind of patterned after Back to the Future. And if you guys have seen the Back to the Future, Michael J. Fox movies, again, not to be too American, but if you've seen those, he had these things he had to achieve throughout the story, but he had this picture because he went back in time to try to change the future. And, well, by changing what happened in the past, now I'm getting confused. But anyway, he had a picture of his family. And if he wasn't doing a good enough job, it started to erase members of his family. They weren't in the future. And so we used that type of a construct one time to do a gradual build. But you can give them something that starts to take away, or you can give them something that starts to build. So those are just a few ways to show progress. And I have an example here. This is a good example from a course that incorporates quite a few of these things. So you have a map of the office, and this is just like a compliance course. And you can go around and visit various places in the office. And as you click them, information comes up, and then you're kind of making a judgment about it, right? Or you're categorizing it, or you're making a judgment, or you're making a decision. As you do that, you can earn various badges for passing off that you know about certain skills. But then you can also see down in the bottom, you have a score for each scenario and how well you do in the scenario, which also adds up to a total score. There's some other things that you see along the bottom. One is that you can collect coins. And I won't go into all of this, but I more so just wanted you to see that, that this is what it would look like in actually showing it in a course. And I also wanted to provide a caution, because as cool as this screen looks, you also want to be careful that you don't overwhelm your learner. If your learner base is not familiar with taking this type of a course, I would probably recommend against having this many things that you're showing or progressing or making them feel like they're having to earn or manage, because it could be a little bit overwhelming. But if they're a more sophisticated audience who's familiar with this type of thing, then it could be fine. But I wanted to show it because it just shows so many examples of what we just talked about. So here are your pro tips. You want to massage your goals and to make sure that they align with your instructional tasks and your real world outcomes when you can. If they at least align with instructional tasks, that's great. If they help to build, if they help to emulate and then build up to the same thing that they would see in the real world, then that's even better. Do your goals, and you can have more than one. You can have one overall goal with kind of some supporting goals, or maybe 2 or 3 main goals. But in one way or another, do they progress the story in a way that's engaging? And then do they add up to something that you feel like will help you to have that big conclusion to your story? You would hope that the big conclusion to your story also aligns with your business outcomes too. If you can make it align with business outcomes, all the better. Then you also want to make sure that your goals direct attention to what you want them to focus on rather than distract or confuse. You try to generate an example of that. So for example, I've seen it in the past where people have set things up that the goals and what they're focusing on throughout the course is not even really the total point of it. And again, the best advice that I have for that is to think about your business goal. When someone completes this course, how is their, and we're saying, okay, project manager, you know, you've taken this course, you've really learned how to manage people and resources and time. What difference does that, you know, actually make to the business? And is there a way I can write that into my story? And almost working backwards from that, you're asking yourselves, okay, when they actually perform these instructional tasks on the job, what are we going to see change in the business? And as a result of that, you know, what metrics are we going to see? And this is following a little bit of Kirkpatrick, right? And then how will that change the business? And then you've got those out there, and then you're kind of cross-aligning them and coming back down that ladder with your story. I don't know if this is helpful to anybody. It's probably not. But anyway, that's the point I'm trying to make. You're also wanting to make sure that they're working in agreement with each other. Sometimes they're so separate and unrelated that it just doesn't make sense. And here's the other thing I would tell you, and I touched on this a minute ago, that I've been really guilty of this in the past. You set this big goal up for them in the story up front, and then sometimes we forget to come back and say, hey, you did it. You know, a lot of times. So for a perfect example, let me go back to this screen. This is a perfect example. So in a course like this, it would be easy to have them kind of go explore the scenario, and then it's only when they come back to the main menu, maybe now instead of 1 coin, there's 2, or instead of 1 badge, there's 2. And we just want them to select another scenario. We forgot to celebrate the moment. And usually it's not on this screen that we want to do that. It's in the moment. So when they make the decision, when they get it right, we want to have a pop-up. We want to have the narrator come in, or the coach, or we want to show something. I have an app on my phone for a local restaurant around here where I get to scan in my receipt and earn points. And every time I do, it like explodes money, and it plays music, and it really makes me feel like I did something, even though I didn't. And I think we forget that sometimes because we're so focused on, oh yeah, we'll just reflect it on the menu. But we need to stop and have a mini celebration. And then at the very end, we also need to celebrate what that's added up to and kind of pull the string through for them about what difference it made. Okay, I'm going to stop again here. Andrew, do we have questions coming in about goals?
Yes, we have some great questions about goals. Is an LMS required to show?
Enough to answer them.
Okay. Okay. Is an LMS required to show goals, or is this something that can be programmed into the course
directly
with the
into
tool?
the course? Yes, you do not need an LMS for this. Let me tell you at the highest level, because that's not what this webinar is about. But if you're sitting around thinking, you know what, I see people do this all the time, and I just don't know how it's done. The answer is variables. So if you're using Lectora, it's not in Captivate, it's called Advanced Actions, I think. In Lectora, it's called variables. I think Storyline calls it a variable. There are system variables that are built into your course, but there's also custom variables that you can create. And that's how this is done. And it may sound complicated, but trust me, I had to learn it for myself back in the days when there were no resources on anything, and it's not super hard. And so if you haven't crossed that bridge, go out there, look up some articles on variables and how you can use them, and it's going to change your life as a designer, and it's not nearly as hard as it seems, but that's how those things are done.
Excellent. Another question. With goals for a training where the participants are unwilling to attend, I see this can be misunderstood as something where the trainer is selling. Please, what is some advice that you could give that would be an alternative to not give this impression?
Oh, I might need a little bit more information on that question. So they're worried that the trainer is trying to sell what?
So participants don't want to participate. They don't want to do it, but then they say, well, look, there's these goals, these badges, these different things, and it starts to sound like the trainer is selling the course. And I guess that's looked down upon.
Well, I would say, I wish I had more context about that. If you have a group of folks who are going to be pretty put off by the idea of earning a badge. So for example, I'm not one of these people. You put me into a course and I earn a little kind of like make-believe badge about something, that doesn't do anything for me. And so if it's something I already didn't want to do, I don't know that that's necessarily going to motivate me. And I think it's a great point that they're bringing this up, because we've got to check against our demographic and the context. And if this is something that people don't want to do, then I wouldn't do it that way. Sometimes you can achieve everything you need to achieve through story, and giving them a challenge and giving them a task and getting them involved that way. For example, if people don't want to do it because they feel like they already know it, I've had that a lot, then you start just putting them in the challenges. Okay, great, show what you know. And then sometimes it surprises them when they're not able to do it, and you kind of give them a consequence. You definitely don't need to be in there with badges and points all the time, especially if it's not going to fit for what your people need. And especially if you really think that it's going to be off-putting, I wouldn't even do it. I would find other ways to engage them by making the course more challenging or rewarding or funny or whatever you think is going to work for them.
Excellent. Along these same lines, is this the same as gamification? Do we need to know anything about gamification to make this work?
Yeah, it definitely is along the lines of gamification for sure. And and although we're not necessarily delving into the topic of gamification today, yes, it is elements of gamification. And so that's, I think, why you especially have to be careful about which ones you choose and how you present it, and not over confusing, and making sure you have the technical capacity to do it. But again, it's not as hard as it looks. I really think that there's a large subset of designers out there that feel like this isn't achievable because you need to have a professional crew to build it, and you really don't. You can do it yourself through variables and then just some selective image state changes. It's shocking, actually, how easy it is. Anyway, I think I went down a bunny trail there.
Okay, one last question on this subject. Well, before I take this last question, there are some other comments here that may be useful. People are saying that it might be cool to have your badges that are earned then available to be placed on LinkedIn or other social media as a bigger way to make it a cool celebration. And another person says, the mini celebrations shown each time the person earns a badge sounds neat, but they need to be super short. It sometimes gets annoying when a lot of time is spent just showing you earned this badge. So those are good points. The last question that we'll take here is, who's making these decisions on your team? Is this collaborative between the ID and the learning developer, or is it just the ID?
I think it really depends on how your team is set up as to how this goes. But I will tell you, on our team, we have to be careful, because I always tell my team, we could write a movie in an hour if we really wanted to, but we're not the ones that have to film it. And so from a timeline and a scope perspective, you've always got to be really mindful of who's developing. And if you're that person, then you generally, hopefully, have a good sense of that. But you definitely want to check yourself before you wreck yourself in that department. But on the topic of checking yourself before you wreck yourself, please learn from my mistakes, because I've definitely been in positions where I've come up with, oh, this is going to be awesome, and I built it, some big HR training that needed to be done in 2 weeks. And I think I've shared this before, but I made it a carnival and they all got to play carnival games till, you know, and that was not cool with the executives. So remember, the more creative you get, the more you put yourself at risk, and probably the more people you need to just do a little bit of just run it by them before you start to engage.
Excellent. Those are all the questions we have for now.
Okay. All right, let's talk about role. This is definitely, I want to spend a little bit of time on this and show you several examples, because this is definitely an area where that can get confusing, can be a little bit of a misstep. So, well, let me come back here. So we're going to talk about two roles, actually. What is the role of the narrator? And then more expansively, what is the role of the learner? And the learner can have many roles. The ones I'm going to talk about today are what we call directly involved, helping, judging, playing, or learning. So the reason that I bring this up is it doesn't seem like it's that complicated of a topic, but it really can be. And because a lot of times in courses I've reviewed, you start to see the writing cross over, where the narrator is not consistently being who the narrator is supposed to be, or because the designer didn't take the time to define the narrator before they started, they start to kind of use the narrator for everything, and it doesn't make sense because you're somewhat breaking the fourth wall. It's like, is the narrator outside the story, or are they inside the story? Are they a character? Are they just the system narrator? Or are they also a character, or are they also a coach? These are things that we've got to get figured out so that we clearly know who the narrator is, and we're only using the narrator at the appropriate times for that role, and that the writing and scripting for who that person is makes sense for whether they're inside or outside the story, or the types of things that they might say. A lot of times a narrator and a coach end up blending into the same person. So it's very common for a course to open up and say, hey, welcome to this course on project management. I'm Carlos, and I'm going to be your guide as we go through and learn about such and such. And so in that case, we see that the narrator and the coach are the same, or maybe he says, hey, I'm Carlos, an experienced project manager, and I'm here to help you today as you are struggling through your desert island or whatever. And maybe he's kind of a floating angel that comes in to coach you once your team doesn't make it to the waterfall. I mean, who is this guy? You've got to decide and strategically use your narrator, because sometimes once you get into the story, there are points you want to make that are going to be really hard to have naturally unfold throughout the story. And so the narrator can actually be a solution for that, because they can exist outside of the story and kind of come in and give information that the learner wouldn't have access to if they're in some kind of a first person situation, for example. So I don't want to get too confusing about that, other than to call out, you need to have a very clear idea of who they are, and keep in mind too that they can kind of be, to use a chess analogy, your queen piece, because they can go anywhere. But what you don't want to do is haphazardly use them everywhere, so that no one really understands who the narrator is, and it just starts to become confusing and conflicting with your story. Then you also need to have the same thing happen for the learner. So the learner can take the course without being in the story. It could be first person, where they're dealing with it directly, or it could be that they're watching other people and either helping them to make the right decisions, or helping them to correct their decisions, or in the case of the one that we just looked at, kind of judging their decision, like, hey, was this the right thing for Bob to do? Or do you think that his behavior, what behavior do you think his category, or I'm sorry, what category do you think his behavior fell into, etc. We can also have the learner, excuse me, just playing if we've gamified it, or it's actually possible to have a creatively themed course where they're just learning. And the course is creative because of how it's themed. And I'll show you some I have some examples of that at the back of our deck. I also wanted to point out that sometimes it is possible for the learner, like we just talked about, or the narrator, and that's why I have these yellow and orange folks at the bottom. Sometimes they're a character in the story, and sometimes they're not. And you can play around with where the narrator and the learner exist, inside or outside of your story. Are they part of the team? Do we want them to have more access to information, and so we don't want them to be in the team, right in the team, in a first person situation, because they'll be too limiting. You can play with a lot of this to solve problems that you're encountering with your story, or your instructional tasks or your goal, you can start to shift these roles around to make sure that you can still get the experience, information, and coaching that you need by just making sure these people are in the right place. So here's some examples. I want to talk we'll just have one example in here, narrator versus coach. So this is an example of, I'm just going to share how you could do this two ways. So we just made a decision, and now the coach is coming in to say, that wasn't quite the right decision. So in the example where we have a narrator, if you wanted to have a narrator that was a system narrator, then he would be the guy who opened the course up and told you what you were going to learn, etc. And then maybe he introduced you to this lady here in the red. Let's call her Nancy. So this is Nancy. She's an experienced HR professional, and she's going to be here to provide insight to you as you make your decisions. Now you've established that you have a system narrator, but you also have a coach, right? And those can be two different people, and they can serve two different purposes. You can also do it where Nancy is that person. Hey, welcome. I'm going to be your guide as you go through, and then you cut that out. There are times when it feels necessary to have two roles because, again, for your purposes, you're going to need somebody who's outside of it all to try to guide them through the system or point them to resources. The system narrator is somebody who's kind of right alongside them. They're not inside the story. And so by not crossing that role, you're not breaking the fourth wall. But there's a lot of times that you can get away with not having that and letting a coach, for example, who might be right in the story and who is a character kind of in the story, be the system guide too. And that's the difference. But you want to be clear and strategic about what you choose to do. Okay, here are examples of the learner. So this is an example of a learner being directly involved. And in a real world situation, it doesn't have a funky theme and we're not earning badges, but we are getting them involved in a story. And so for this particular story, we've put them in a position where they're approving or denying the strategic projects at a company for the year. And so they have various people coming to them and pitching their projects, but they have a limited amount, and you can see here on the left, of time, money, and headcount. They also don't want to do anything that's particularly risky. And so each project has an associated numeric value for each of those things because it's teaching them to consider them on whether the project's worth it or not, as compared to when they're comparing it to the annual priorities. And so that's what this particular activity was about. But you can see this person's looking right at me. I'm directly involved. I'm the person making the decisions. They're talking to me. So that's what directly involved looks like. Now, when you're helping, it looks a little different. In this particular case, we're helping this team decide how they can talk to each other in a way that is supportive and inclusive. So this is in a course about bias, unconscious bias. And so we've just identified that somebody in the previous screen, we've just identified that somebody said something that wasn't 100% great. And so now we're going to come and we're going to help that person choose to do something differently. And you can see down here we have a meter that's called team engagement. And this is a great example of how my goal, which is to increase team engagement, is reflective of the business purpose of the course. Because the business purpose of the course is we all get more when we feel comfortable at work and when we're being respected, and when people aren't putting labels on us or assuming we can or can't do something because of our gender or because we have kids or don't have kids, etc. And so this particular activity is a great example of having a goal that is shown through a meter that is appropriately aligned to not only the outcome of the story, but also the business outcome of the course. But in this particular example, we're talking about how it's a great example of helping. Then we have judging. We talked about this already, where they're clicking into the scenarios and then making a judgment about it. So they're not a character in the story. They're just judging what other characters are doing or labeling or identifying to perform their instructional tasks. Here's an example of playing, where the entire course is just a game board. And the only goal that they have is to win the game. But as they're going throughout the game, they're being presented with tasks and decisions to make, and they're trying to unlock different stations in the restaurant. And so that's an example of playing that doesn't really necessarily have a story attached, so a good example too of how you don't have to have every piece in the puzzle sometimes. So here are your pro tips. I think we've talked about a lot of those. We've talked about figure out who your narrator is and be consistent. I probably failed to mention that if you choose to have a system narrator as opposed to like a coach, it's usually a good idea to have them be differing genders. It just makes it easier for the learner to determine who's talking. And then in the learner role, please make sure that whatever role you choose, this is the biggest thing I could say about learner role. Whatever you choose, and I only show you all of those different examples to help you understand that whatever you choose, that you have options so that the thing that you choose is in alignment with the activities they need to perform. This is the biggest thing about everything we're talking about. You can do all this creative stuff, but your cupcake will fall apart if it is not instructionally sound. If that person does not have the opportunity to perform those tasks, then everything that we've done really is for naught, because they won't walk away with the information that they need. I included this example, if the learner is a bridge inspector in the story, but suddenly they're observing a board meeting and helping to make decisions, now we're covering our instructional tasks, but we're not doing it in a way that makes sense for the learner's role. So now we have to start to say, should they be a first-person bridge inspector? Or is there a way to remove them from the story and maybe make them a judge or have them help? And that's why I'm highlighting to you that you have those other options so that the learner can directly participate in as many of those instructional tasks as they can, while still having it make sense for their role and within the story. And I think we've covered this one down here as well. So I'm going to pause. We have one more to get to that's fairly short, but I think we have time if anybody had a question or two about this piece.
Yeah, one quick question for this person. Can you give a little more detail? You mentioned the fourth wall. Can you kind of describe that principle?
Yeah, so the principle of the fourth wall, I feel like I'm the least qualified person to talk about this, is when you, like, for example, when you go to see a play, right? So the characters in the play are talking to each other, and it's like you're not there, right? And they're getting upset with each other and having drama with each other. And they have the three walls that are around them, the back of the stage and the sides of the stage, and that's their space. And the fourth wall is removed because you are the fourth wall. So to break the fourth wall means that someone from a character from the story would turn and look at you and start talking to you, even though you're not involved in the story. And so it breaks the suspension of disbelief. Andrew, you should have answered this question. You're like a filmmaker. So it breaks the suspension of disbelief, and it feels weird, and it doesn't work. And so that's part of why you've got to decide who the learner is and who the narrator is, so that you can keep that fourth wall intact and people can stay engaged without being like, wait a minute, why are they talking to me? I'm not part of this.
There's a lot of comedy film producers, film writers that break the fourth wall all the time. Ferris Bueller is one of them. House of Cards, somebody mentioned that. I'm thinking of pretty much any Mel Brooks movie is going to break the fourth wall at some point as well.
Well, and I'm not saying it's necessarily wrong to break the fourth wall. But what I'm saying is when you're doing it unintentionally because you're not thinking about it, then it's kind of like a grammar rule, right? If you're going to use slang intentionally, that's one thing. But when you just have bad grammar, then people are like, wait a minute, this doesn't sound right. Does that make sense? You think about The Office, for example, and how, some of the best parts of The Office were the cutaways, but they wrote that into the story because part of the story was that these people were being filmed. And that allowed, because they set that construct up, that the narrator of the story got to be a character in the story because it was the film crew, then it allowed the characters to talk directly to us, and it was awesome. So if you want that, you just have to engineer it and do it on purpose so that it's not clumsy and doesn't distract.
All right, great. That's all the questions on that one.
Okay, great. Instructional tasks. Well, I only say great because I'm running out of time and I wanted to cover this one last piece. Instructional tasks. So this is probably the piece we need to say the least about because we're instructional designers, but I do want to show you how all this stuff adds up, and part of why I say it's a puzzle. So it's a puzzle because if we start kind of here at the middle, whatever the learner is doing within your course, obviously we want it to enable the performance objective. That's what matters most. And in a normal course, you would just stay there. And maybe into this outer ring to make sure that that performance objective is supported with information that's either presented or embedded within the course. But as we start to theme our course, we're adding in layers of complication and alignment. So we have to make sure that that task also aligns with the role of the learner and their goal for the course. And that in the case of a story, in the case of a story, it also leads to aligned consequences and outcomes. And that hopefully that same instructional task, when completed successfully, progresses the story forward. And I was going to say this at the start, and I don't think that I did. I think a lot of people would say, oh, it totally makes sense that you should start with instructional tasks because that's what's most important. And sometimes I feel like that's really hard to do because your instructional tasks have to align with so many of these other pieces that it's usually good to visit those other pieces first. And again, like a puzzle, just kind of sort of explore one area. Yeah, I think that sounds good, but how does this fit to this? And then you're making sure all the way around that they fit. And when they look good, you bring them together and you solidify your decision. But not until that time, because your instructional tasks have to align with so many of these other pieces. I also just wanted to show you these couple examples that I told you about at the end here. These are some simple but fun alternatives. You don't always have to have a story. You don't always have to. This particular one was medical, and this is just a practice question to help them understand. But they took the whack-a-mole concept from a whack-a-mole game, and then, I don't think I included this, but you know how the doctor has the little thing where he hits your knee? So in this game, you have that, but you get to whack a doc. And it's also an example of a concept that may not work or may not be appropriate in all settings, but these people felt that it was. And so there's a question that comes, and then you have to whack the person who's giving the wrong answer within a certain amount of time to do a score. So it's just a fun game to play while you learn information. And so you notice it doesn't have all of the pieces we've talked about, but it can still be fun. This is another more simple and real-world example where the theme of the course was that we were trying to use a lot of social media activities. It was for a much younger demographic. And so this one models like a social media app. So something happens, and then you label it by labeling the picture with a sticker, similar to what you might do on Instagram, for example. So it didn't have a story, but it did have a theme. And so all of the activities in one way or another dealt with mobile devices or social media apps. We did some swipe right, swipe left, kind of Tinder type activities and that type of thing. So anyway, so those are just examples. And I know this is very high level. It's a complicated topic. But what I mainly wanted to share today is that there are all of these pieces that need to be considered and that need to fit in order for the execution of your creative work to come together rather than fall apart. So there we go. Andrew, I've left you 2 minutes at the end. I hope you're super proud of me.
I am very proud. There's a few more questions that are here that that we didn't have time to get to. What I'd like to do is I will grab those here. I'll grab a screen grab and send them over to Misty so that everyone can get their questions answered. We'll try to get those answered afterwards. Okay. Misty is going to be presenting at this year's ELBX. It's a user conference coming up on June 11th. You guys don't want to miss that. You're presenting with Jen Fairbanks, is that right?
Yeah, I think if you guys have seen our periodic table of instructional design,
there it is behind your desk.
If you've ever seen that, we're actually presenting on that and helping people better understand the elements within that resource.
So that's just one of the breakout sessions that we're going to be doing in the afternoon. We have a big, huge set of presenters at the beginning, including Dr. Michael Allen. Andrew Sibley is going to be presenting here from ELB. So all kinds of stuff at ELBX. You guys won't want to miss that. You can learn more at elearningbrothers.com. Also schedule a demo, see some more of the work that eLearning Brothers Custom has built, that Misty and her team has built. You can give us a call at 801-796-2767. Always send in an email at info@elearningbrothers.com or reach out to us at elearningbrothers.com. Thank you, Misty. This has been a great webinar. Very, very useful information here. Lots of positive feedback here. And we appreciate your time, and we appreciate you doing this. We'll see all of you guys hopefully next time.
Okay.
See ya.
Thank you.